alone in a silent prison, with nothing but a table, a bed, and his own thoughts. Dr. B is on the edge of collapse. But then, a book. A strange one. 150 chess games. And with it begins a dangerous obsession. One that could save him or destroy him. This is part 3 of Stefan Zweig's chess story. If you're ready, let's begin. That lasted for a fortnight, during which I lived outside of time, outside the world. If war had broken out then, I would never have discovered it, for my world comprised only table, door, bed, basin, chair, window, and wall, every line of whose scalloped pattern embedded itself, as with a steel graver, in the innermost folds of my brain every time it met my eye. Then, at last, the hearings began. Suddenly, I received a summons. I hardly knew whether it was day or night. I was called and led through a few corridors. I knew not whither. Then I waited, and knew not where it was, and found myself standing at a table behind which some uniformed men were seated. Piles of papers on the table, documents of whose contents I was in ignorance. And then came the questions, the real ones and the false, the simple and the cunning, the catch questions and the dummy questions. And whilst I answered, strange and evil fingers toyed with papers whose contents I could not surmise, and strange evil fingers wrote a record, and I could not know what they wrote. But the most fearsome thing for me at those hearings was that I never could guess or figure out what the Gestapo actually knew about the goings-on in my office, and what they sought to worm out of me. I have already told you that at the last minute, I gave my housekeeper the really incriminating documents to take to my uncle. Had he received them? Had he not received them? How far had I been betrayed by that clerk? Which letters had they intercepted? And what might they not already have screwed out of some clumsy priest at one of the cloisters we represented? And they heaped question on question. What securities had I bought for this cloister? With which banks had I corresponded? Do I know Mr. So-and-so, or do I not? Had I corresponded with Switzerland and with God knows where? And not being able to divine what they had already dug up, every answer was fraught with danger. Were I to admit something that they didn't know, I might be unnecessarily exposing somebody to the axe. If I denied too much, I harmed myself. The worst was not the examination. The worst was the return from the examination to my void, to the same room with the same table, the same bed, the same basin, the same wallpaper. No sooner was I by myself than I tried to recapitulate, to think of what I should have said and what I should say next time, so as to divert any suspicion that a careless remark of mine might have aroused. I pondered, I combed through, I probed, I appraised every single word of testimony before the examining officers. I restated their every question and every answer that I made. I sought to sift out the part that went into the minutes, knowing well that it was all incalculable and unascertainable. But these thoughts, once given rein in empty space, rotated in my head unceasingly, always starting afresh in ever-changing combinations and insinuating themselves into my sleep. After every hearing by the Gestapo, my own thoughts took over, no less inexorably, the martyrizing questions, searchings, and torments. And perhaps even more horribly, for the hearings at least ended after an hour. But this repetition, thanks to the spiteful torture of solitude, ended never. And always the table, chest, bed, wallpaper, window, no diversion, not a book or magazine, not a new face, no pencil with which to jot down an item, not a match to toy with. Nothing, nothing, nothing. It was only at this point that I apprehended how devilishly intelligently, with what murderous psychology this hotel room system was conceived. In a concentration camp, one would perhaps have had to wheel stones until one's hands bled and one's feet froze in one's boots. One would have been packed in stench and cold with a couple of dozen others. But one would have seen faces, would have had space, a tree, a star, something, anything to stare at. While here, everything stood before one unchangeably the same, always the same, maddeningly the same. There was nothing here to switch me off from my thoughts, from my delusive notions, from my diseased recapitulating. That was just what they purposed. They wanted me to gag and gag on my thoughts until they choked me, and I had no choice but to spit them out at last, to admit everything that they were after. Finally, to yield up the evidence and the people. I gradually became aware of how my nerves were slacking under the grisly pressure of the void. And, conscious of the danger, I tensed myself to the bursting point in an effort to find or create any sort of diversion. I tried to recite or reconstruct everything I had ever memorized in order to occupy myself. The folk songs and nursery rhymes of childhood, the Homer of my high school days, clauses from the Civil Code. Then I did problems in arithmetic, adding or dividing, but my memory was powerless without some integrating force. I was unable to concentrate on anything. One thought flickered and darted about. How much do they know? What is it that they don't know? What did I say yesterday? Like, what ought I to say next time? This simply indescribable state lasted 4 months. Well, 4 months. Easy to write, just about a dozen letters. Easy to say, too. 4 months, a couple of syllables. The lips can articulate the sound in a quarter of a second. 4 months. But nobody can describe or measure or demonstrate, not to another or to himself, how long a period endures in the spaceless and timeless. Nor can one explain to another how it eats into and destroys one. This nothing and nothing and nothing that is all about. Everlastingly, this table and bed and basin and wallpaper, and always that silence, always the same warder who shoves the food in without looking at one, always those same thoughts that revolve around one in the nothingness until one becomes insane. Small signs made me disturbedly conscious that my brain was not working right. Early in the game, my mind had been quite clear at the examinations. I had testified quietly and deliberately my twofold thinking, what should I say, and what not, had still functioned. Now I could no more than articulate haltingly the simplest sentences, for while I spoke, my eyes were fixed in a hypnotic stare on the pen that sped recording across the paper, as if I wished to race after my own words. I felt myself losing my grip. I felt that the moment was coming closer and closer when, to rescue myself, I would tell all I knew, and perhaps more, when, to elude the strangling grip of that nothingness, I would betray 12 persons and their secrets without deriving any advantage myself but the respite of a single breath. One evening, I really reached that limit. The warder had just served my meal at such a moment of desperation when I suddenly shrieked after him, "Take me to the board. I'll tell everything. I want to confess. I'll tell them where the papers are and where the money is. I'll tell them everything. Everything." Fortunately, he was far enough away not to hear me. Or perhaps he didn't want to hear me. An event occurred in this extremist need, something unforeseeable, that offered rescue, if only for a period. It was late in July, a dark, ominous, rainy day. I recall these details quite definitely, because the rain was rattling against the windows of the corridor through which I was being led to the examination. I had to wait in the anteroom of the audience chamber. Always, one had to wait before the session. The business of letting one wait was a trick of the game. They would first rip one's nerves by the call, the abrupt summons from the cell in the middle of the night. And then, by the time one was keyed to the ordeal, with will and reason tensed to resistance, they caused one to wait. Meaningless. Meaningful waiting. An hour, 2 hours, 3 hours before the trial, to weary the body and humble the spirit. And they caused me to wait particularly long on this Thursday, the 27th of July. Twice the hour struck while I attended, standing in the anteroom. There's a special reason, too, for my remembering the date so exactly. A calendar hung in this room. It goes without saying that they never permitted me to sit down. My legs bored into my body for 2 hours, and I find it impossible to convey to you how my hunger for something printed, something written, made me stare at these figures, these few words. 27th July, against the wall. I wolfed them into my brain. Then I waited some more, and looked to see when the door would open at last. Meanwhile, reflecting on what my inquisitors might ask me this time, knowing well that they would ask me something quite different from that for which I was schooling myself. Yet in the face of all that, the torment of the waiting and standing was nevertheless a blessing, a delight, because this room was, after all, a different one from my own. Somewhat larger, and with 2 windows instead of 1, and without the bed, and without the basin, and without that crack in the windowsill that I had looked at 1,000,000 times. The door was painted differently, a different chair stood against the wall, and to the left stood a filing cabinet with documents, as well as a clothes stand on which 3 or 4 wet military coats hung, my torturer's coats, so that I had something new, something different to look at last something different for my starved eyes. And they clawed greedily at every detail. I took in every fold of those garments. I observed, for example, a drop suspended from one of the wet collars. And ludicrous as it may sound to you, I waited in an inane excitement to see whether the drop would eventually detach itself and roll down, or whether it would resist gravity and stay put. Truly, this drop held me breathless for minutes, as if my life had been at stake. It rolled down after all, and then I counted the buttons on the coats again. 8 on one, 8 on another, 10 on the third. And again I compared the rank marks. All of these absurd and unimportant trifles toyed with, teased, and pinched my hungry eyes with an avidity which I forgo trying to describe, and suddenly I saw something that paralyzed my gaze. I had discovered a slight bulge in the side pocket of one of the coats. I moved closer to it and thought that I recognized, by the rectangular shape of the protrusion, what this swollen pocket harbored. A book. My knees trembled. A book. I hadn't had a book in my hand for 4 months, so that the mere idea of a book in which words appear in orderly arrangement, of sentences, pages, leaves, a book in which one could follow and stow in one's brain new, unknown, diverting thoughts, was at once intoxicating and stupefying. Hypnotized, my eyes rested on the little swelling which the book inside the pocket formed. They glowered at the spot as if to burn a hole in the coat. The moment came when I could no longer control my greed. Involuntarily, I edged nearer. The mere thought that my hands might at least feel the book through the cloth made the nerves of my fingers tingle to the nails. Almost without knowing what I did, I found myself getting closer to it. Happily, the warder ignored my singular behavior. Indeed, It may have seemed to him quite natural that a man wanted to lean against a wall after standing erect for 2 hours. And then I was quite close to the coat, my hands purposely clasped behind me so as to be able to touch the coat unnoticed. I felt the stuff, and the contact confirmed that here was something square, something flexible, and that it crackled softly. A book. A book. And then a thought went through me like a shot. Steal the book. If you can turn the trick, you can hide the book in your cell and read again at last. The thought, hardly lodged in me, operated like a strong poison. At once there was a singing in my ears. My heart hammered. My hands froze and resisted my bidding. But after that first numbness, I pressed myself softly and insinuatingly against the coat. I pressed, always fixing the warder with my eye, the book up out of the pocket, higher and higher, with my artfully concealed hands. Then, a tug, a gentle, careful pull, and in no time the little book was in my hand. Not until now was I frightened at my deed. Retreat was no longer possible. What to do with it? I shoved the book under my trousers at the back, just far enough for the belt to hold it, then gradually to the hip so that while walking I could keep it in place by holding my hands on the trouser seams, military fashion. I had to try it out, so I moved a step from the clothes stand. 2 steps, 3 steps. It worked. It was possible to keep the book in place while walking if I but kept pressing firmly against my belt. Then came the hearing. It demanded greater attention than ever on my part. For while answering, I concentrated my entire effort on securing the book inconspicuously, rather than on my testimony. Luckily, this session proved to be a short one, and I got the book safely to my room, though it slipped into my trousers most dangerously while in the corridor on my way back, and I had to simulate a violent fit of coughing as an excuse for bending over to get it under my belt again. But what a moment that, as I bore it back into my inferno, alone, at last, yet no longer alone. You will suppose, of course, that my first act was to seize the book, examine it, and read it. Not at all. I wanted, first of all, to savor the joy of possessing a book. The artificially prolonged and nerve-inflaming desire to daydream about the kind of book I would wish this stolen one to be. Above all, very small type, narrowly spaced with many, many letters, many, many thin leaves so that it might take long to read. And then I wished to myself that it might be one that would demand mental exertion, nothing smooth or light, rather something from which I could learn and memorize. Preferably, oh, what an audacious dream, Goethe or Homer. At last I could no longer check my greed and my curiosity. Stretched on the bed so as to arouse no suspicion in case the warder might open the door without warning, tremblingly I drew the volume from under my belt. The first glance produced not merely disappointment, but a sort of bitter vexation, for this booty, whose acquirement was surrounded with such monstrous danger and such glowing hope, proved to be nothing more than a chess anthology, a collection of 150 championship games. Had I not been barred, locked in, I would, in my first rage, have thrown the thing through an open window. For what was to be done? What could be done with nonsense of the kind? Like most of the other boys at school, I had now and then tried my hand at chess to kill time. But of what use was this theoretical stuff to me? You can't play chess alone. And certainly not without chessmen and a board. Annoyed, I thumbed the pages, thinking to discover reading matter of some sort, an introduction, a manual. But besides the bare rectangular reproductions of the various master games with their symbols, a 1 to a 2, knight to f1, knight to g3, etc., To me then unintelligible, I found nothing. All of it appeared to me as a kind of algebra, the key to which was hidden. Only gradually I puzzled out that the letters A, B, C stood for the vertical rows, the figures 1 to 8 for the rows across, and indicated the current position of each figure. Thus, these purely graphic expressions did nevertheless attain to speech. Who knows, I thought, if I were able to devise a chessboard in my cell, I could follow these games through. And it seemed like a sign from heaven that the weave of my bedspread disclosed a coarse checkerwork. With proper manipulation, it yielded a field of 64 squares. I tore out the first leaf and concealed the book under my mattress. Then, from bits of bread that I sacrificed, I began to mold king, queen, and the other figures, with ludicrous results, of course. And after no end of effort, I was finally able to undertake on the bedspread the reproduction of the positions pictured in the chess book. But my absurd breadcrumb figures, half of which I had covered with dust to differentiate them from white ones, proved utterly inadequate when I tried to pursue the printed game. I was all confusion in those first days. I would have to start a game afresh, 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. But who on earth had so much unused and useless time as I, slave of emptiness, and who commanded so much immeasurable greed and patience? It took me 6 days to play the game to the end without an error, and in a week after that, I no longer required the chessmen to comprehend the relative positions. And in just 1 more week, I was able to dispense with the bedspread. The printed symbols, A1, A2, C7, C8, at first abstractions to me, automatically transformed themselves into visual plastic positions. The transposition had been accomplished perfectly. I had projected the chessboard and its figures within myself, and, thanks to the bare rules, observed the immediate setup, just as a practiced musician hears all instruments singly and in combination upon merely glancing at a printed score. It cost me no effort, after another fortnight, to play every game in the book from memory, or in chess language, blind, and only then did I begin to understand the limitless benefaction which my impertinent theft constituted. For I had acquired an occupation, yet one that negated the nothingness that enveloped me. The 150 championship games equipped me with a weapon against the strangling monotony of space and time. From then on, to conserve the charm of this new interest without interruption, I divided my day precisely. 2 games in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, a quick recapitulation in the evening. That served to fill my day, which previously had been as shapeless as jelly. I had something to do that did not tire me, for a wonderful feature of chess is that through confining mental energy to a strictly bounded field, the brain doesn't flag even under the most strained concentration. Rather, it makes more acute its agility and energy. In the course of time, the repetition of the master games, which had at first been mechanical, awakened an artistic, a pleasurable comprehension in me. I learned to understand the refinements, the tricks and feints in attack and defense. I grasped the technique of thinking ahead, planning combinations and riposting, and soon recognized the personal note of each champion in his individual method, as infallibly as one spots a particular poet on hearing only a few lines. That which began as a mere time-killing occupation became a joy, and the personalities of such great chess strategists as Alekhine, Lasker, Bogol-Zhobov, and Tartakover entered into my solitude as beloved comrades. My silent cell was constantly and variously peopled, and the very regularity of my exercises restored my already impaired intellectual capacity. My brain seemed refreshed, and, because of constant, disciplined thinking, even keenly whetted. My ability to think more clearly and concisely manifested itself, above all, at the hearings. Unconsciously, I had perfected myself at the chessboard in defending myself against false threats and masked dodges. From this time on, I gave them no openings at the sessions, and I even harbored the thought that the Gestapo men began, after a while, to regard me with a certain respect. Possibly, they asked themselves, seeing so many others collapse, from what secret sources I alone found strength for such unshakable resistance. This period of happiness, in which I played through the 150 games in that book systematically, day by day, continued for about 2.5 to 3 months. Then I arrived unexpectedly at a dead point. Suddenly, I found myself once more facing nothingness. For by the time that I had played through each one of these games innumerable times, the charm of novelty and surprise was lost. The exciting and stimulating power was exhausted. What purpose did it serve to repeat again and again games whose every move I had long since memorized? No sooner did I make an opening move than the whole thing unraveled of itself. There was no surprise, no tension, no problem. At this point, I would have needed another book with more games to keep me busy, to engage the mental effort that had become indispensable to divert me. This being totally impossible, my madness could take but one course. Instead of the old games, I had to devise new ones myself. I had to try to play the game with myself, or rather, against myself. I have no idea to what extent you have given thought to the intellectual status of this game of games. But one doesn't have to reflect deeply to see that if pure chance can determine a game of calculation, it is an absurdity in logic to play against oneself. The fundamental attraction of chess lies, after all, in the fact that its strategy develops in different wise in two different brains. That in this mental battle, black, ignorant of white's immediate maneuvers, seeks constantly to guess and cross them, while white, for his part, strives to penetrate black's secret purposes and to outstrip and parry them. If one person tries to be both black and white, you have the preposterous situation that one and the same brain at once knows something and yet does not know it. That functioning as white's partner, it can instantly obey a command to forget what, a moment earlier as black's partner, it desired and plotted. Such cerebral duality really implies a complete cleavage of the conscious, a lighting up or dimming of the brain function at pleasure, as with a switch. In short, to want to play against oneself at chess is about as paradoxical as to want to jump over one's own shadow. Well, briefly, in my desperation, I tried this impossibility, this absurdity, for months. There was no choice but this nonsense if I was not to become quite insane or slowly to disintegrate mentally. The fearful state that I was in compelled me at least to attempt this split between black ego and white ego, so as not to be crushed by the horrible nothingness that bore in on me. Dr. B relaxed in his deck chair and closed his eyes for a minute. It seemed as if he were exerting his will to suppress a disturbing recollection. Once again, the left corner of his mouth twitched in that strange and evidently uncontrollable manner. Then he settled himself a little more erectly. Well then, I hope I've made it all pretty intelligible up to this point. I'm sorry, but I doubt greatly that the rest of it can be pictured quite as clearly. This new occupation, you see, called for so unconditional a harnessing of the brain as to make any simultaneous self-control impossible. I have already intimated my opinion that a chess contest with oneself spells nonsense. but there is a minimal possibility for even such an absurdity if a real chessboard is present, because the board, being tangible, affords a sense of distance, a material extraterritoriality. Before a real chessboard with real chessmen, you can stop to think things over, and you can place yourself physically first on this side of the table, then on the other, to fix in your eyes how the scene looks to black and how it looks to white. Obliged as I was to conduct these contests against myself, or with myself, as you please. On an imaginary field, I was obliged to keep fixedly in mind the current setup on the 64 squares, and, besides, to make advanced calculations as to the possible further moves open to each player. Which meant, I know how mad this must sound to you, imagining doubly, triply, no, imagining sextuply, duodecibly for each one of my egos, always 4 or 5 moves in advance. Please don't think that I expect you to follow through the involutions of this madness. In these plays in the abstract space of fantasy, I had to figure out the next 4 or 5 moves in my capacity of white, likewise as black, thus considering every possible future combination with 2 brains, so to speak, white's brain and black's brain. But even this auto-cleaving of personality was not the most dangerous aspect of my abstruse experiment. Rather, it was that with the need to play independently, I lost my foothold and fell into a bottomless pit. The mere replaying of championship games, which I had been indulging in during the preceding weeks, had been, after all, no more than a feat of repetition, a straight recapitulation of given material, and as such, no greater strain than to memorize poetry or learn sections of the civil code by heart. It was a delimited, disciplined function, and thus an excellent mental exercise. My 2 morning games, my 2 in the afternoon, represented a definite task that I was able to perform coolly. It was a substitute for normal occupation. And, moreover, if I erred in the progress of a game or forgot the next move, I always had recourse to the book. It was only because the replaying of games of others left myself out of the picture that this activity served to soothe and heal my shattered nerves. It was all one to me whether black or white was victor. For was it not Alekin or Bogolyubov who sought the palm? While my own person, my reason, my soul derived satisfaction as observer, as fancier of the niceties of those jousts as they worked out. From the moment at which I tried to play against myself, I began, unconsciously, to challenge myself. Each of my egos, my black ego and my white ego, had to contest against the other and become the center, each on its own, of an ambition, an impatience to win, to conquer. After each move that I made as ego black, I was in a fever of curiosity as to what ego white would do. Each of my egos felt triumphant when the other made a bad move, and likewise suffered chagrin at similar clumsiness of its own. All that sounds senseless, and in fact, such a self-produced schizophrenia, such a split consciousness with its fund of dangerous excitement, would be unthinkable in a person under normal conditions. Don't forget, though, that I had been violently torn from all normality, innocently charged and behind bars, for months martyrized by the refined employment of solitude, a man seeking an object against which to discharge his long-accumulated rage. And as I had nothing else than this insane match with myself, that rage, that lust for revenge, canalized itself fanatically into the game. Something in me wanted to justify itself, but there was only this other self with which I could wrestle. So, while the game was on, an almost maniac excitement waxed in me. In the beginning, my deliberations were still quiet and composed. I would pause between one game and the next, so as to recover from the effort. But little by little, my frayed nerves forbade all respite. No sooner had Ego White made a move than Ego Black feverishly plunged a piece forward. Scarcely had a game ended, but I challenged myself to another. For each time, of course, one of my chess egos was beaten by the other and demanded satisfaction. I shall never be able to tell, even approximately, how many games I played against myself during those months in my cell as a result of this crazy insatiability. 1,000, perhaps more. It was an obsession against which I could not arm myself. From dawn to night, I thought of nothing but knights and pawns, rooks and kings, and A and B and C and Mati and castle. My entire being and every sense embraced the checkered board.